Welcome to this week's edition of Word of Truth Podcast. This is Jordan.
And this is Jaron. And so the past couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about communication. We talked about like us communicating to God, to each other, so on and so forth. And this week, we're kind of keeping that same idea, but we're flipping the script on it. We're talking about a lack of communication. By this, I mean we're talking about the 400 years of silence between the Old and the New Testament. So to kind of set the stage for those of you who aren't as familiar, the 400 years of silence is the period between the Old and New Testament. It ends with Malachi. We have the prophet Malachi saying some things, leaving us with the last image of where Israel is, which if you read through Malachi, it's not the most pleasant picture. And then it opens back up in Matthew with Christ coming onto the scene. And so a lot happens within that 400 years, even though nothing is written. There's a lot in between the lines. And there's a lot that happens that sets up and bridges the gap between where we left the Jews in the Old Testament and where things need to be when Christ comes on the scene. And so today we're going to look more so on like a very 10,000 foot worldview scope of what's going on with this. And then over the next couple of weeks, we're going to kind of dig a little bit deeper and bring it closer to home, tying into what like is going on to set us up for the New Testament. And so
part of this like history that we want to look at today, we're going to talk about the world events that took place. So, the rising and the falling of the empires we can line that up and see as it was prophesied in Daniel chapter 2, but also looking at how during this time there were all kinds of different religions that we have today that are practiced today that had their beginnings in this time. So we kind of want to hit briefly on those next week. I know we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the changes that took place within Israel, the nation of Israel itself. But that's kind of the direction we're going to go.
Yeah. So the way I kind of broke mine out was starting out looking at like who was ruling when. So at the end of the Old Testament, we find that Persia was the ruling body. And if you remember back to, was it Daniel with the prophecy of the big statue?
Yeah, Daniel.
Exactly where that is. But it goes through like you have a gold head, silver chest, bronze like quads or whatever, iron, and then iron and clay feet. And it's talking about the empires that are actually going to be rising and falling and taking place right during this time. So we find Persia coming onto the scene. I believe they represent silver within that vision. They're at the end of the Old Testament. They give a lot of favorable policies towards the Jews, as we see towards the close of the Old Testament. Allow them to go back and rebuild the temple, so on and so forth. Yeah,
and I think it was in one of our podcasts, maybe it wasn't, that we talked about this. But one of the reasons that they actually had a more favorable policies with the Jews was because they were also a culture that worshiped one God. Now, they didn't serve Jehovah, but they saw or they felt like a connection because it wasn't like all the other empires or the other kingdoms around them, right? This was a people that they kind of looked at and saw themselves in, right? That they worshiped one God. So that's kind of the background of why the big picture, right? This is the Lord working. But from our picture, from man's view, this is part of the reasoning.
Yeah. And wasn't it also prophesied Cyrus of Persia would let them free?
Yes.
Hold on. Let me see. Isaiah 45, if you want to look that up. It's actually, he's named by name. That there will be a king from Persia named Cyrus who will set them free and allow for this kind of to take place. And so that takes us to about 331 BC. For reference, the Old Testament closes right about 400 BC. And so this is the state that we're in to the end of the Old Testament and a little bit past it, about 70 years past it, is with this favorable outlook towards the Jews with Persia in the rule. However, then a man named Alexander the Great comes along from Greece. Go ahead.
Ah, first, his father Philip of Macedon came and started, but then Alex the Great continued that conquest and did far greater than what his father had done. Right? And when you think about it, it truly is amazing because before Philip of Macedon began his conquest and then Alexander the Great picking up, those in Greece, they were just city states. So you think the kingdom was small, and then, and this is kind of what we see, like Babylon. Again, it was small and then built into this great empire. All of these places were small and then built to become uh, just these awesome, kingdoms and empires, and how it's crazy to think the conquest that Alexander the Great went on and the success that he found.
Yeah. Well, and we're gonna find as each next empire rises, they get to the point where they take over all of the known world. And it's like each one after another continues to do that. And that's kind of how it was with Persia. They took over just about everywhere that was known. Then Greece comes along and they usurp them, coming 331. And with Alexander the Great, they took over basically everyone that, like, the entire world that people knew existed. And this had huge impacts on, the dynamic of the region. It had huge impacts on globalizing everyone and kind of creating more of a cohesiveness with everyone in the known world.
So one thing that was different about Alexander the Great, um, when you see all these other empires begin to rise, right? They take people from here that they conquered and put them in a different spot, right? To get them to be unfamiliar. What Alexander the Great does is he doesn't so much mix people as he starts to put governors in place um, to rule in that land. And he wanted them to keep their custom, but also learn the Greek custom, and or what would become known as the Greek custom. So then that way they were all held to like a similar culture. They understood, the different traditions and the feasts and had the same language because he wanted to unify. What was happening before is you kind of see like as people are just moved around, they become separate and they don't feel like they get to, so much keep their identity. Where Alexander the Great wanted to keep that, but also have this kind of a form of nationalism.
Yeah,
Nationalism. I'll get it
nationalism.
one of these times. So that's kind of one of the things that's unique about what he did. Um, but yeah, I don't
And
know.
it plays a huge role, though, because that led to the rise of Hellenism, which was kind of a conglomeration of a lot of different religions. I was like taking the Greek influences, which they took, the polytheism, all the gods that they worship, and it also combined it with traditions like the Jewish traditions and presented weird kind of culture mixes throughout the entire kingdom. It also was beneficial, though, to the Jews, kind of high level, because it allowed for them to continue in a relatively peaceful worshiping during this time. Things were still pretty settled down, still pretty similar to how they were in Persia. Slightly different because they had, more of an influence over them, and Greek became the main language spoken everywhere rather than Hebrew. Um, but, as a general, things were pretty peaceful while Alexander the Great was going, or was leading Greece at this time.
Yeah, and when you think too, like um, he's one of the few who not only waged war, because I mean any king or any empire or emperor would obviously lead a war to conquer more land, but he was one who was actually there fighting with his soldiers. Like he didn't want to stop, and you see him go from Greece, which is over here, right, and conquer Egypt and make his way all the way over as he's about to enter into what is now um, Asia, or kind of India is where I think he stopped. But he was on this conquest for years, fighting, and you see kind of his empire start to find its or start to fall as he had to stop to go back and handle some like situations, or he stopped his conquest for a time. He caught a disease and then he died. And
Yeah,
then after that, he was the glue to that empire surviving.
yeah, and that's so in 323 BC is whenever Alexander the Great dies, and that's when things kind of start to fall apart. So the kingdom gets split up into four different regions. The ones that are mainly dealing with the area that we're kind of going to be talking about with, Israel, would be Ptolemy, or the Ptolemaic region, which is Egypt basically, and then the Seleucid Empire, which was, kind of that Middle Eastern central area. Um, and so that area originally gets divided to Ptolemy, Ptolemy. However you say that, it goes to that man. All right. And so he takes over and kind of keeps the same thing going for the Jewish people as Alexander the Great had. There's the influence of Greece over it, but still pretty favorable to those people. It allowed them to worship, gave them a lot of religious freedom, gave a lot of, self-governing as long as it fell under the Grecian rule. As long as you're still subject to his rule, you were allowed to kind of worship how you wanted to worship. However, things kind of start to change in 312 because that's when Ptolemy and Seleucid that's when they kind of start to butt heads. And so that part of the empire falls to the Seleucid Empire. And that's when things begin to change with Antiochus, I believe the man's name is, that took over. And he had a lot tighter rule on, religious freedoms and that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, so it's going to be during this time, right, that we're going to be leading into this Maccabean revolt.
Yeah.
Um, as he was trying to push for um, the Jews to have become more Greek-like. Again, he wanted to have that similar culture, right? More of a one people. Just a side note, real quick, on how you talked about how Alexander the Great, this Greek empire, was split into four, right? Right here, we have a historical validation of the statement: "United we stand, and divided we fall." And then you kind of see this later on with the Roman Empire,
Yeah.
centuries later. Um, and so that's just kind of something to keep in the back of your mind, right? These empires were great when they were united, when they were one, but as they broke off and they had different leaders, that's when they became more divided, and you see them leading to their collapse.
Yeah. And so as you're talking about, so we get to that point, they're divided. The Seleucid Empire takes over around 312 BC. Um, and it's whenever Antiochus Epiphanes, which is the son of the original Antiochus, takes over, that's when things really, really start to go like terribly, leading towards the Maccabean revolt. So he takes over, and his father had started kind of clamping down, wanting everyone to be under the Greek culture, and he takes it to the next level. So then he bribes the high priesthood, and he puts a family that he wants to be there, like in place. Um, and then he also, to kind of help take away from the Judaism and kind of take away their dignity, he builds a gymnasium right outside of the temple. Now, the reason why this is important is in the Greek culture, they definitely like glorified masculinity. And so to go into it, you would have to go into the gymnasium. They wanted you to be naked to show off, the amazing human body. And so they put it right outside the temple so that there would constantly be naked people walking in and out of there, which is kind of a slap to the face of the Jewish people, of which it was considered a sin to be naked in public. And then not only were there naked people constantly walking outside their temple, but also they put in force a rule that you had to go at least once to the gymnasium. So not only did they have to be subject to seeing it, they had to subject themselves at least once a year to go into that naked and like sin basically and like defile their conscience. And so with that, it really shattered the relationship, and that's when you see the Jews start to build resentment to being ruled by the Greeks. And then on top of that, once they find that the Jews aren't really succumbing to the rule, they decide to go a step further and defile the temple. They placed idols on the altars. They were forcing high priests to sacrifice to them. Um, they outlawed circumcision. They outlawed observing the Sabbath day. And then they put idols inside of the town squares of everywhere in the Judea, Jerusalem area and forced you to worship them. And if you didn't, you would be killed. And so this is what sets the stage leading up to the Maccabean revolt, is they get subjected to some pretty terrible things, by the government. And then because of that, they decide to react. And so we find leading into this in 167, they begin to have a guerrilla warfare after one of the generals comes and talks to Matthias, who is the high priest, and told him, you have to set the stage for all of those in Jerusalem by committing a public sacrifice to the idol, of which one of the people with him then just killed the officer and kicked off guerrilla warfare against the Greeks, which lasts for about 7 years. And so after this, they get kind of outnumbered, but Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't really view them as much of a threat. So he sends just kind of his worst, lesser effective generals and kind of like says, all right, you go handle this. And then the Jews, who are much stronger than everyone was expecting them to be, will go and completely destroy the army. Then he sends a slightly better one and a slightly better one, until finally he gets sick of it and sends about 7,000 people with one of his best generals into Jerusalem to try and take it over. But it doesn't work out due to the fact that the Jews had a better know of the landscape, and it said because they prayed to God and God was on their side, they were able to, take back over the city of Jerusalem. Yeah. Oh, wait. And it was actually 60,000 Seleucid soldiers rather than 7,000. The Jews had 7,000 soldiers. I'm taking a lot of this from worldhistory.org. They have a great article on it. But go ahead.
I was just going to say, it is interesting that we can go back and look at and read of this history and see how effective, right, guerrilla warfare has been.
Yeah.
And how important it is to know the landscape of the battle that you're going to go into. So, spiritual lesson, there is one there. We're not going to get into that today. On historian viewpoint of this, though, right? You follow this even into our history now, right? As we won our freedom, it's more like it just went on so long that Britain finally they didn't have enough to continue, so they kind of threw in the towel. But we did that, with the different conflicts and wars that we've had with Korea, with Vietnam. Again, you kind of see this tactic. That's something I had not studied before. That they were using this guerrilla warfare all the way back then.
Yeah, and it works out to the benefit, because in a lot of the battles that they went into trying to take this back over, they're outnumbered close to 5-1. But due to the fact that they knew the land better, they were able to win and drive out the Seleucid army. And so this comes to the point then at the end of it, about 160 BC is whenever it's said that the Maccabean revolt ends and they officially, succeed in taking over. And so by that, they regain their religious liberty and a little bit of autonomy over the, area of Judea, Jerusalem. So that was kind of a big deal back then. And so after that, you have a little bit of time between where they kind of go in relative peace with autonomy over that area. You still have the Grecian influence and empire, very much so, in power during this time. But then we find come about 63 BC, is whenever Rome becomes, kind of a superpower on the scene. And that's what really takes us in to the New Testament, is the rise of Rome. So they're a very systematic warfaring people. They end up at, down the road taking over the entire Grecian Empire and basically the entire known world of the time. And as they kind of rise to power and take over their influence, um, they had a strong admiration for the Greek culture and the way that that empire was run. And so they leave Greek as the primary language used and leave a lot of those cultural practices in place. But also, due to the fact that they were very systematic and they had such a large empire, they introduced a lot of important organizational structures across the world. Comprehensive road system, a lot of which actually still exists today. And they network basically the entire empire. They also create very, very strong merchant systems and trading systems, and due to that, spread even further the speaking of the Greek language, and that becomes the merchant language, which then becomes the layman's language, which further kind of ingrains that across the world, getting everyone on the same page so that everyone basically knew how to speak Greek and everyone had access to this road system.
Now, I also want to kind of add here, as we're getting into the New Testament, it's important to know kind of the setting that Christ is going to find himself in, or that the people are in, because you go back, they had, after the Maccabean revolt, as you kind of discussed, they had this time where they did have some autonomy. But as Rome begins their conquest, they send General Pompey, and we would recognize the city that's named after him. He's the one that staged the war or the battles against them to take over. And as we get closer and closer, which this was about 70 to 50 years before Christ, 50 to 70 years before Christ, they're starting to feel that pressure again. Again, losing that freedom that they had. But Rome also did, because they had such turmoil with the Jews, the generals that were there in that area of Judea, they did allow, in Jerusalem, they did allow some freedom for them to practice, the religious, because Rome was very open to different religions.
Yeah.
They didn't, but you needed to not bow to Caesar, but give honor to Caesar. That was like the one thing, and that would later be pushed, right? That you were to serve Caesar and him only. But this is gonna, that would be years down the road. But that's kind of the setting up the political and just tension that the Pharisees and the other Jews had towards the Roman officials, and often why they tried to set Jesus up, right, to either show one side or choose the other. But Christ in every situation had the perfect answer, of which they were amazed at. How did you get out of this? But it's also interesting that when we look at this and we talk about the 400 years of silence, right, we would think that because, and we'll address this next week in more detail, so many were unprepared for Christ. You look and when you start to read in the New Testament about these crowds just flocking out to go see and meet John the Baptist in the wilderness, like Christ even asked, why did you go in the wilderness? Like, who were you going to see? And the reason is people identified him as a prophet. For once they're finally, or for the first time in a while, they're hearing, a message from the Lord. And so they did perceive him to be somebody like Elijah or one of the other prophets. And that's why even the Pharisees go out to hear him. That's why they left the cities to go out and hear him. That's what drew the interest from the group. Because for so long, they didn't have this. And there were some, as we, we'll read in Matthew and in the early accounts of Christ, of his birth and those early years of his life. There were some who were looking and who were preparing for that time, who recognized the signs, but the vast majority didn't. Um, but we kind of want to throw that in to just kind of keep that in the back of your mindset, as we're getting into this. But a point that, did you have anything else on Rome?
Well, I was just going to say, kind of to what you're talking about as well. We call it the 400 years of silence because that's like, it's the 400-year gap where there were no prophets, there were no inspired words. And that's why also, as you're kind of saying, when John the Baptist comes on the scene, this is the first inspired man in generations to show back up, And so there's a lot that happens here, but then like within terms of inspired word from God, there's nothing. And so that's why it's important to understand world scope. 400 years changes a ton. And so understanding like, all right, what all has happened in this area to the Jewish people from a worldview. And then like next week, we're going to dig into what happened to them on their religious and like specifically with the Jews view. And then, take it further from there.
And you think with all that was happening at this time, all the different conquests and the kings and the emperors that came in and the armies that came in, they would have been looking for somebody, right? Somebody had come along, and you see that in Israel's history, that they would be faithful and then they would fall. They'd go into this like bondage, or they'd be persecuted by another group, and then here arises somebody else to help lead them out of it. They're faithful, and then we just continue on in this cycle, right? But now here we're at this point where they weren't faithful. These people come in and overtake them, and now they're subjects to this new empire. But then it never turns around where they have another priest, because God wasn't raising up priests, or not priests, prophets or anybody yet, because it wasn't time, right? He had accomplished his work. But
the Israelite people, even today, you don't see them rising to their own like completely independent Jewish state like it was back in the times of David and Solomon. That came to an end. And it still hasn't come back in the way that people picture it coming back,
Yeah.
And so that's really, I guess this is a little bit more into like next week's discussion, but that's really what this 400 years is kind of, I think it's working to show, So.
Yeah. Now, I kind of want to throw in how we kind of introduced that there were other religions that began during this time. Just, self-promotion. If you want to hear a sermon on this, I preached one. You can look at it at southeastchurchofchrist.org. It was
you can send us an email at a.word.of.truth.podcast@gmail.com, and we'll send it to you.
Yeah. It was on, silence, and there's some things that we want to take from this, right? When you have silence, it's the absence of sound. So you can't take it as, acceptance of, well, I can do this because it doesn't say, right? God hasn't said I can't do this. During this time, we see groups of people begin their own religions because there's an absence of God, right? You don't have his people rising up to conquer a land to show the power of the Lord. Instead, you have his people becoming subjects and, falling into sin. And we'll, again, talk about that next week. But during this time, 530 to 480 BC is when Buddhism begins. Confucianism begins. Taoism begins, right? These are mainly in the Eastern world, what's known as Asia now. These are the practices, but we're somewhat familiar with them today. And then you see, again, you have all the different religions that began. You have the Roman mythology, the Greek mythology that all continued during this time.
Well, and you have the rise of Stoicism, you have the rise of an emphasis on philosophy, a rise on an emphasis of science and of mathematics and all that kind of stuff, which has become religions today as well.
Yeah, and so it is like it kind of helps build up what I would think would be an interesting study maybe for us down the road is to look at these different um, religions, the different gods and idols that people served during this time, and that are well established by the time that Christ uh, comes and lives on earth, and then look at his teachings and see, okay, so how does he prove this wrong? Because not only did he go um, in everything about him challenge the Romans and the society of that time, where the Romans were all about war. Christ says, if somebody does wrong to you, right, turn the other cheek, right? Don't fight that. But the Romans were always about, fighting. Um, Pray for your enemies, right? These are all foreign concepts by this time. The home life was so different. Christ is calling for the wife to be equal in the marriage with the husband, right?
Yeah.
How foreign is that at that point? And even you get into American history, women were almost viewed as second class.
Well, and back then they were viewed as property, like
Yeah.
legitimately nothing more than property.
So when you look at that, again, I think it would be cool to go and look at Christ's teachings because there's specific statements that he makes, right? I am the light, or um, I am the door. He says about entering into that sheepfold, and it's just small statements like that where we look and you can see that the Romans worshipped. I can't think of the god right off of. Um, you know, without looking it up. But they had a God that they worshiped that they believed was the beginning and was the doorway and the gateway. And here Christ says, I am the door. So I think it would be cool because that, it sets up that time. It kind of sets up his teaching as he challenged everything about society, everything about what man thinks. He says, look, this is what you think, this is what you've been practicing, but it's so different than that.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely would be interesting.
So
But
I know that was a little off topic, but
a little bit, but it ties in because all of that, like all of his teachings, and why it's so important to know what's going on from a world view in these 400 years, is because what happens here sets the stage for what Christ teaches. As you're saying, like what happens within these 400 years to both the Jewish people on a world scale, and like starting at the world and going all the way down, it sets the culture and sets the tone for what Christ's message is going to be. And so knowing these things and looking into them and understanding them will only help us better understand what the New Testament is all about and what Christ's teachings are all about. And so hopefully this lesson has been somewhat beneficial to everyone who listens to it. Hopefully it gives you something to kind of help change your perspective just a little bit on what happened in these 400 years, or helps deepen your knowledge there. We hope you tune in for the next couple of weeks as we continue diving into it because, like, for instance, this podcast is going to be 35 minutes, and that's not even scratching the surface. What? Oh, you froze. But, okay, I lost you. I don't know what happened, so I'm just going to keep talking. So we hope you tune in for the next couple of weeks as we continue on this study, and because there's so much left for us to discuss, starting from just looking at the worldview, there's so much to look at, and digging deeper down as we look into what happened with the Jews will be another very, very good discussion. So with that being said, we'd like to thank you for listening in to this week's edition of A Word of Truth podcast. I'd like to give you a friendly reminder that he who has ears to hear, listen up. And as always, have a great week.